The grand mansion of Alexander Sterling, one of the wealthiest millionaires in the city, was bathed in golden light that spilled from chandeliers imported from Italy and walls that whispered secrets of power, money, and pride. It was the night of his legendary annual gala, an event where only the most powerful businessmen, fashion icons, aristocrats, and politicians gathered to flaunt wealth and cement connections. The red carpets had been rolled out, the security was tightened, the photographers gathered at the entrance, and the ballroom was filled with laughter that echoed off the marble walls. But beneath the glittering facade of champagne glasses and diamonds lay a cruel secret. Alexander had sent an invitation, not as an act of kindness, but as a calculated joke. He had invited his cleaning lady, Evelyn Carter, a woman whose skin, uniform, and silent footsteps usually made her invisible in the corridors of power. For years she scrubbed floors, polished silverware, and quietly slipped through rooms where she was never truly seen. She was known only as the cleaning lady, a shadow with a mop, a background figure in a world of grandeur. Alexander, driven by arrogance and the twisted humor of the wealthy, thought it would be amusing to watch her humiliation if she dared show up. He had laughed with his fellow elites days before the gala, mocking the idea of a servant walking among them in rags, imagining the whispers, the sneers, the cruel chuckles. To him, it was entertainment, another way to remind people of the walls between rich and poor. But what no one knew was that Evelyn carried within her a story much bigger than the dust she cleaned or the uniform she wore. Behind her quiet gaze were scars of struggle, dignity unbroken, and a strength that wealth could never buy. The night of the gala arrived, and Alexander waited with smugness, sipping wine, ready for his cruel entertainment to unfold. Guests dazzled in silk gowns, diamonds glittered like stardust, and the orchestra played a tune that wrapped the air with elegance. Every eye sparkled with vanity, every laugh rang with superiority. But then the ballroom doors creaked open and silence fell like a curtain. The guards straightened. The music faltered. Heads turned. There, stepping across the threshold, was Evelyn. But she was not the Evelyn they knew. She was no longer the invisible cleaner in black and white uniform. She walked like fire reborn. A crimson gown hugged her form, shimmering with sequins that caught. The golden chandeliers and scattered light across the room like shooting stars. Diamonds adorned her neck, cascading like frozen rivers of light. Her hair, styled with perfection, framed her face in waves of elegance. Her steps were poised, confident, each one echoing like the beat of destiny across the marble floor. The crowd gasped. The millionaire, Alexander Sterling himself, nearly dropped his glass as his jaw parted in disbelief. His eyes widened, unprepared for the storm he had unleashed. Evelyn was not a joke. She was the showstopper. She was not the background. She was the center of the stage. Whispers rippled through the hall like electricity. "Is that her? The cleaning lady? Impossible." But no whisper carried mockery. It carried awe, shock, and the dawning realization that something far greater was unfolding before their eyes. Evelyn's presence bent the air itself, commanding respect with every glance. The orchestra, almost as if fate directed them, picked up a slower, dramatic tune, and she seemed to glide as though the music belonged to her. Alexander's cruel joke had turned into his greatest humiliation, for all eyes that once turned to him as the host now turned only to her. But Evelyn did not smirk, did not look for revenge. Her grace was her power. She did not lower herself to mock those who mocked her. Instead, she became untouchable, a queen born in the very house where she once bent down to scrub the floors. Alexander's heart raced with something he had not felt in decades, fear, mixed with respect. For the first time, he realized that wealth could not buy presence, could not manufacture dignity. And as Evelyn approached the center of the room, a silence thick as velvet draped the guests. She paused, turned, and her eyes, sharp yet calm, met Alexander's. The millionaire, who once towered above her, now felt small, diminished by the weight of her poise. She bowed her head slightly, not as a servant, but as a sovereign acknowledging her subject. The crowd erupted into applause, some standing, some nearly crying, for they had seen more than beauty. They had seen a transformation of spirit, the triumph of dignity over arrogance. That night, no one remembered Alexander's wealth, his chandeliers or his expensive wines. They remembered Evelyn, the woman who walked in as a joke and left as a legend. And when the night closed, and Alexander sat alone, glass in hand, he knew that respect was not given by money, but earned by the unbreakable soul of those who refused to be diminished. Evelyn had not just shown up, she had risen, and the world would never forget her. The applause that filled the ballroom did not stop immediately. It rolled like thunder, refusing to die, as though the crowd itself had realized they were not merely witnessing a gala but a moment in history. Yet, beneath the claps and gasps, a current of tension still simmered. Alexander Sterling's face flushed pale, then red, his lips tightening, as he glanced around the room and saw what he feared most. He was no longer the center of attention. The wealth that once demanded respect now meant nothing in comparison to the commanding aura of the woman he had mocked. Evelyn Carter did not need to speak. Her silence screamed louder than any insult could. She paused at the edge of the runway that had been set for the night's fashion show. And for a moment, the crowd thought she would turn back. But then, with a graceful motion, she stepped onto the very runway where professional models had strutted moments ago. The spotlight, almost as if enchanted, swung toward her. Gasps filled the hall. "She doesn't belong there," whispered one socialite, clutching her pearls. But another voice countered, "Look at her. She belongs more than any of us." Evelyn's stride was not rehearsed like the models. It was natural, fierce, filled with years of silent resilience now translated into elegance. Her heels struck the runway with precision, each step echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. For the first time in her life, she was not cleaning someone else's grandeur, she was embodying it. The crowd's eyes widened with every move, mesmerized by a woman they thought they knew but never truly saw. Alexander's hands clenched on the arms of his chair. Sweat beaded his forehead despite the cool air. He leaned slightly forward, lips parted, unable to look away. He remembered the cruel laughter he had shared with his guests earlier, in the week when he bragged about inviting the cleaning lady to his exclusive event. He remembered mocking her plain shoes, her tired uniform, her silence. And now, that same woman was shattering his empire of pride without speaking a single word. But Evelyn was not just there to look beautiful. Her arrival was deliberate, calculated. Few in the room knew her history, and fewer still understood that the woman walking before them carried a secret. Years before becoming a cleaner, Evelyn had been a young girl with dreams of fashion, of artistry, of standing on a stage. She had designed gowns out of scraps, practiced her walk in mirrors cracked by poverty, and even won small-town contests before tragedy struck. Her parents had passed away young, leaving her to care for her younger siblings, forcing her into jobs that buried her talents beneath mops and buckets. The gown she wore tonight had not been borrowed. It was her own design, stitched late at night under dim light bulbs after long shifts of cleaning. Every bead, every fold was her creation, a piece of her soul woven into fabric. She had not come to the Millionaire's party as a victim. She had come as an artist reclaiming her stage. The guests whispered again, but this time the whispers were reverent. She designed that dress herself," one man muttered, astonished. "Do you see the tailoring? It's beyond what money buys." The fashion critics in attendance, who had been expecting nothing but shallow glamour, now scribbled furiously in their notebooks, unable to deny the genius before their eyes. The orchestra, sensing the rising tide, shifted their tune once more. The melody slowed into a haunting rhythm, and Evelyn moved with it, her gown glittering like blood-red fire under the lights. The applause began again, louder this time, people rising to their feet, clapping as though the very idea of elegance had been redefined in front of them. Alexander Sterling's chest tightened. Rage fought against awe inside him. This was not the joke he planned. This was not the humiliation he expected. Yet he could not deny it. Evelyn had outshined him in his own kingdom. And for the first time in decades, Alexander realized that respect was not something money demanded, it was something earned. And Evelyn had earned it without saying a single word. As Evelyn reached the end of the runway, she turned slowly, her eyes scanning the audience. The spotlight caught her jewelry, sending shards of light scattering like stars across the hall. Her gaze settled on Alexander and the room seemed to freeze. Silence swallowed the applause. Alexander's throat tightened as if invisible fingers gripped it. She held his gaze for a long moment, neither hateful nor forgiving, but steady, powerful, commanding. And then, with a soft, graceful nod, she acknowledged him. The gesture was small, but its meaning was seismic. She was not here for revenge. She was here to show dignity, to show that no cruelty could diminish her worth. And that was what destroyed Alexander more than any insult could have. Because in that moment, he knew he had lost. The millionaire who thought himself untouchable had been reduced to a background figure in his own gala, while the cleaning lady he mocked became the legend everyone would remember. The applause erupted again, this time thunderous, shaking the very chandeliers above. Evelyn smiled faintly, and though her lips curved gently, her eyes held the power of storms. Guests rushed forward after the show, not to Alexander but to Evelyn, showering her with praise, asking about her gown, her background, her talent. Some whispered apologies for the way they had overlooked her before. Others begged to know if she would design for them. She had walked into the room invisible, but she would leave unforgettable. Alexander sat back in his chair, trembling, his mind racing. For the first time, respect, true respect, did not bow to wealth. It bowed to character, to dignity, to the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be broken. And as Evelyn walked past him to leave the stage, her gown brushing lightly against the carpet, he whispered under his breath words he had never said to any servant in his life. Respect. The night did not end with the applause. In fact, that was only the beginning of Evelyn Carter's rise and Alexander Sterling's downfall. The crowd swarmed her after she stepped off the runway, their jeweled hands reaching out, their voices eager, tripping over each other to ask questions, to flatter, to draw her into their circles. Reporters who had been invited to cover the Millionaire's gala turned, their cameras toward Evelyn, the mystery woman whose entrance had stolen the spotlight. Flashbulbs lit up her face, capturing her calm smile, her eyes that seemed to know a secret the world was only beginning to understand. Alexander sat frozen in his chair, his fists trembling on his knees, as he watched his empire of attention crumble before his eyes. For years, people came to his parties to admire him, to flatter him, to bask in his wealth. But tonight, no one looked at him. They looked only at her, the woman he had invited as a joke. Evelyn, for her part, moved gracefully among the people, answering their questions with dignity but never arrogance. "Who designed your gown?" one woman asked breathlessly. Evelyn smiled softly and said, "I did." The crowd gasped as though she had confessed to a miracle. Another guest, a famous designer himself, leaned forward, eyes wide. "Do you realize what you've created? This is no ordinary dress. This is art." Evelyn bowed her head in thanks but did not boast. She knew her gown was more than fabric. It was her life stitched together, her grief, her survival, her dreams hidden in every thread. As she spoke, Alexander's memory began to burn. He remembered the day she had first come to work in his mansion, a shy woman, thin, carrying exhaustion in her eyes. He had dismissed her as unimportant, just another shadow to clean up after his grand dinners. He remembered mocking her once for humming while she scrubbed. He had laughed with guests about how even the help tried to pretend they had souls. And now here she was, outshining every diamond in the room. His stomach twisted, his arrogance cracked. For the first time, shame pierced through his wealth like a dagger. The orchestra tried to resume the evening, but no one was listening to the music anymore. Their attention clung to Evelyn as if she were the melody itself. The women whispered of empowerment, their eyes shining with tears as they spoke, of how she had walked in with nothing but her dignity and turned the room upside down. The men who once scoffed at her now offered business cards, eager to be connected to her before the world discovered her. Journalists typed frantically, sensing that this was the story that would ripple across headlines. The cleaning lady who outshined the millionaire. And yet, beneath Evelyn's elegance was a heart that remembered everything. The humiliation, the invisibility, the loneliness of being overlooked. She remembered polishing the very floors her heels now graced. She remembered the cold winters when she had walked to work with worn-out shoes, her feet numb but her will unbroken. And she remembered the nights she stitched her gown in silence, each needle prick reminding her that pain could be turned into beauty. She was not here for revenge. Revenge would have been easy. She was here for respect, to prove not only to Alexander but to herself that dignity never dies. The whispers in the ballroom grew into open declarations. "She's extraordinary," cried one guest. "Alexander Sterling should be honored she came." Alexander's face twisted at the words. Honored? He had invited her as a joke, but the joke was on him. He realized with icy clarity that wealth had blinded him, made him believe people like Evelyn were beneath notice. But now the very people he sought to impress were praising her, not him. His ego crumbled, leaving behind only the bitter truth. He was not respected. He was feared, envied, tolerated, but never loved. Evelyn, the woman he thought invisible, had gained in one night what his billions had never earned: genuine respect. As the gala reached its height, something happened that no one expected. The fashion show director, a woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, stepped forward and approached Evelyn. "Would you walk the runway again?" she asked, her voice trembling not from nerves but from awe. The crowd gasped. Evelyn froze, her heart pounding. She was not a professional model, not trained, not prepared. But then she realized she had been preparing all her life. Every struggle, every humiliation, every quiet night stitching her dress had led her here. She nodded softly. The director clapped her hands, and the orchestra rose again, this time with a triumphant melody. Evelyn stepped onto the runway once more. This time she did not walk as a guest sneaking into a wealthy man's party. She walked as the star. Cameras flashed endlessly, capturing her every move. The millionaire who had invited her as a joke now sat in the front row, his jaw clenched, his pride shattered, as his gala became her coronation. When she reached the end of the runway, the audience rose to their feet, cheering, clapping, shouting her name. "Evelyn, Evelyn!" The sound shook the hall, echoing beyond the chandeliers, beyond the marble walls into history itself. Alexander tried to stand, tried to regain control of his event, but his voice was drowned by the roar of applause. No one looked at him anymore. His wealth, his chandeliers, his orchestra, all had been stolen by the power of a woman's dignity. He sank back into his chair, defeated. Evelyn, however, did not gloat. She bowed graciously to the audience, her eyes shining with tears she refused to let fall. She had won not by humiliating Alexander, but by being true to herself, and that was the greatest victory of all. When the night ended, the headlines had already been written. Millionaire invited cleaning. Lady as a joke, but she stole the gala. The story spread like wildfire, not just because of the transformation, but because of the truth it revealed, that respect cannot be bought, only earned. And Alexander Sterling, the man who had mocked her, was left to face the bitter reality that the world respected. Evelyn Carter more than it ever respected him. As Evelyn left the ballroom, stepping into the cool night air, she did not look back. She did not need to. She had walked into the room invisible and walked out unforgettable. And as Alexander sat in his empty mansion later that night, the sound of applause still ringing in his ears, he whispered the word that had burned in his throat all evening: respect. The city did not sleep after the gala. By the next morning, every newspaper headline carried her name. "From maid to muse," one magazine screamed in bold letters. Another ran the story under the title, "The Diva Who Stole the Spotlight." Television anchors debated her transformation, asking who she was, where she came from, and how she had managed to do what none of the city's elites had ever dared: reduce Alexander Sterling to silence. In the markets, in the offices, in coffee shops, strangers spoke of her as if they had known her all their lives. Taxi drivers pointed at billboards and said proudly, "That's Evelyn Carter." She showed them all. It was as though a new star had risen overnight, one that no one could ignore. Evelyn, however, did not seek fame. She woke up in her small apartment, sunlight spilling across the floor, and for a moment she wondered if it had all been a dream. The gown she had stitched with her own hands still hung across the chair, proof that the night had been real. Her phone buzzed endlessly, calls, messages, invitations. Fashion houses wanted her. Television shows wanted her. Even charities reached out, asking if she would represent them. The world wanted a piece of Evelyn Carter. But she sat quietly at her kitchen table, sipping her tea, her thoughts far away. She remembered the years of silence, of sweeping floors, of scrubbing stains from marble, of being invisible in rooms full of chandeliers. She had not walked that runway for glory. She had walked it for something far more sacred, respect. Meanwhile, Alexander Sterling could not escape the storm. For the first time in his life, the cameras turned on him not to celebrate his wealth but to ridicule his arrogance. Reporters asked, "Why did you invite her in the first place? Was it really a joke?" Social media lit up with harsh words. Memes of him sitting stunned while Evelyn shone on the runway spread like wildfire. His name was trending, but not in admiration. His empire shook as investors questioned his judgment, and old allies distanced themselves. In his vast mansion, Alexander wandered from room to room, haunted by the echo of applause that had not been his. He poured himself drink after drink, trying to drown the memory of her grace. But the more he drank, the clearer the vision became. Evelyn standing tall, the audience rising to their feet, his own humiliation painted across his face. And yet, somewhere in that shame, a seed of realization began to grow. For the first time in his life, Alexander saw what he had never wanted to see, that money did not command true respect. He remembered the hollow smiles at his parties, the fake laughter at his jokes, the eyes that never lit up when he entered the room. They had followed him because of his power, not because of his worth. But Evelyn, she had walked in with nothing but dignity, and she had won their hearts. That truth cut deeper than any loss of money ever could. The following week, Evelyn received an invitation she did not expect. It was from a renowned fashion house in Paris, offering her a place not as a cleaner, not even as a model, but as a designer. They had seen her gown, recognized the genius in her stitching, and wanted her creativity on their stage. She hesitated at first. Paris was a world far from her small apartment, far from the streets she knew. But then she remembered the women at the gala who had whispered of empowerment. The way little girls would look at her now and believe they too could rise. She accepted. Her journey to Paris was another transformation. Cameras flashed at the airport as she departed. Fans gathered to wave goodbye, holding posters that read, "Our Diva." When she arrived in Paris, the city embraced her not as a former cleaner but as an artist. The fashion house unveiled her designs at their next show, and once again the world applauded. This time, however, Evelyn was not walking for herself alone. She was walking for every woman who had been overlooked, every worker who had been treated as invisible, every soul who had been mocked but never broken. Back in his mansion, Alexander watched the news of her success with heavy eyes. He had lost everything he once believed made him powerful, and yet he could not bring himself to hate her. Instead, he felt something strange, something he had never allowed himself to feel: admiration. He knew he could never undo what he had done, never erase the arrogance that had led him to treat her as a joke. But perhaps he could at least do one thing right. He decided he would go to her. It was months later, at a grand hall in Paris, where Evelyn stood as the honored guest of a charity gala she had organized. She had chosen the cause herself, supporting underprivileged workers, giving them opportunities to rise through art and education. As she greeted guests, Alexander appeared at the edge of the room. His tuxedo was immaculate, but his face was not the face of the proud millionaire she once knew. It was lined with humility, with exhaustion, with something that looked very close to regret. The crowd murmured, unsure why he had come. Some expected conflict, others expected spectacle. Evelyn, however, remained calm. She looked at him, and for a long moment their eyes locked. The man who had mocked her, and the woman who had transcended him. Alexander approached slowly, each step heavy as though he were carrying the weight of his past. When he finally stood before her, he did not speak immediately. The silence in the room grew thick. Then, in a voice that trembled with the unfamiliar strain of honesty, he said, "Evelyn, I was wrong." Gasps rippled through the hall. The mighty Alexander. Sterling admitting fault was something no one had ever witnessed. He bowed his head, his pride shattered. "I invited you to humiliate you, but you taught me more in one night than I have learned in a lifetime of wealth. You taught me what respect means, and for that I will never forget you." The room was stunned. Cameras clicked, but Evelyn did not gloat. She placed a hand gently on his arm and said, "Respect is not given by words, Alexander. It is shown in actions. If you want it, you must change the way you live." Her voice was calm but powerful, echoing in the hall. Alexander nodded, his eyes moist, and in that moment even his enemies knew he was sincere. The audience erupted not in mockery but in admiration. Admiration for Evelyn, who had turned humiliation into dignity, and for Alexander, who had finally learned humility. From that night on, Evelyn Carter became more than a symbol of transformation. She became a legend. Schools taught her story. Young girls dreamed of walking in her footsteps. Workers found courage in her name. And Alexander Sterling, once a symbol of arrogance, spent the rest of his life supporting her causes, no longer the star of the show, but a man who had finally understood the true meaning of respect. Evelyn never returned to being invisible. She did not need to. She had shown the world that respect cannot be mocked out of existence. It can only rise stronger, brighter, unstoppable. And whenever she looked back on the night when a millionaire invited her as a joke, she did not remember the laughter or the whispers. She remembered the moment she stepped onto the runway, head held high, and the world finally saw her for who she truly was. Years passed, but the story of Evelyn Carter did not fade. If anything, it grew brighter with time, woven into the fabric of society like a timeless legend. In schools across the nation, children studied her journey not as a tale of fashion but as a story of dignity, perseverance, and the triumph of respect. Teachers told their students, "Look at Evelyn. She was not born into power. She was not given her crown. She created it with her own hands, stitch by stitch, step by step, until the world had no choice but to see her." Little girls in humble neighborhoods practiced walking in front of mirrors, balancing old scarves on their shoulders, whispering to themselves that one day they, too, would walk into a room with heads held high. But Evelyn herself did not rest on admiration. Fame never clouded her purpose. She used her influence as a torch, shining light into the darkest corners where people were still silenced and overlooked. She built schools for young women who had been told education was not their path. She opened workshops where cleaners, tailors, cooks, and workers could learn trades and build futures. And every year she held a gala not for the elite, but for those who had never been given a stage. At her galas, janitors read poetry, street artists painted murals, and young seamstresses displayed their designs. For Evelyn, it was never about revenge against the world that had mocked her. It was about building a world where no one else would be mocked again. Alexander Sterling remained by her side, though never in the same light. His fortune had diminished, not from ruin, but from choice. Piece by piece, he sold his assets, funneling them into Evelyn's causes. To the world, it was a shocking transformation. Once the proud millionaire who believed money was power, now a man working quietly behind the scenes, humbled but redeemed. Whenever people asked why, he gave the same answer. Because respect is the only legacy worth leaving. He became a shadow in Evelyn's world, but a necessary shadow, one who finally understood that supporting greatness was more valuable than claiming it. Despite her global influence, Evelyn never lost the core of who she was. She still visited the quiet streets where she once lived, still sat with neighbors who remembered her sweeping steps and scrubbing floors. She spoke to them not as a celebrity but as one of their own, reminding them that dignity was not given by others, it was born within. Her presence gave hope to those who had once felt forgotten, and that hope rippled outward like a tide, lifting entire communities. But the world is never without darkness. With her rise came critics who whispered that her humility was an act, that her charities were built for fame. Rumors spread, fueled by those who envied her power. At one gala, a journalist attempted to humiliate her by questioning her origins, mocking her accent, trying to strip her of the pride she had built. The hall grew tense, many fearing Evelyn would be crushed by the cruelty of the attack. But she stood steady, her eyes calm, her voice unwavering as she said, "I was born in humility and I am not ashamed of it. If you think it weakens me, then you have not learned what strength is." The room erupted in applause, drowning out the journalist's voice. The world was reminded once again that Evelyn Carter could not be broken. The true test of her legacy, however, came decades later. Time had painted silver into her hair. Her steps had grown slower, but her spirit remained radiant. She had become a matriarch, not just to her own family, but to generations who called her a mentor, a teacher, a queen of dignity. On the 40th anniversary of the night she first walked that runway, Paris honored her with a statue in the heart of the city. The unveiling drew crowds larger than any parade, larger than any celebrity gathering. People traveled from across the globe, carrying flowers, banners, and tears of gratitude. As the cloth fell from the statue, Evelyn saw herself immortalized not in jewels, not in gold, but in a simple yet powerful pose, her head raised, her gown flowing like a river of strength, her hand reaching outward as though lifting others with her. The crowd erupted, chanting her name, their voices echoing into the sky. Cameras captured Alexander Sterling, now an old man standing in the front row, tears streaming down his face. He leaned on his cane, his voice hoarse, but his words clear. "She saved me. She saved us all." That night, Evelyn sat alone in her quiet room, the celebrations behind her, the city still buzzing with her honor. She looked at the stars from her balcony, remembering the girl she once was, the cleaner who swept floors in silence, who stitched dresses in secret, who carried dreams no one believed in. That girl was still with her, alive in every heartbeat. Evelyn whispered softly into the night, as if speaking to her younger self, "We did it. We showed them. Respect is the crown they can never take away." And with that, the world knew her story was not just about a single night at a Millionaire's gala. It was about every soul who had ever been mocked, every worker who had ever been overlooked, every woman who had ever been silenced. Evelyn Carter had not just walked into a room, she had walked into history.